Any video game players out there? Any video game players? A few willing to admit it. All right. Anybody familiar with the game Alex Kidd in Miracle World? We're going to stick a picture of this up on the screen. Anybody know this one? Okay, this was our video game, all right? So growing up, we didn't have a video game system, and my grandparents rather wanted to get us one for Christmas, much to my parents' chagrin. And so we ended up with a Sega Master System. Nobody even knows what the Sega Master System is. This is basically the Sega version of Mario, right? So when we got this game, if you've ever been a gamer or gotten excited about a game. I mean, this is like the first video game, right? And so we were so excited. And what do you do when you first get a video game? You try and figure out how to win it, right? I mean, you're just trying to get through and make it through the end, trying to figure out how to master this game. But the problem was, you young people, you don't appreciate this, but back in the 80s, we didn't have what are called memory cards. Right? I mean, the memory card was the big cartridge you stuck in there, and that had the memory of the game on it, but there was nothing else. So you got 3 lives, 0 continues, and 0 saves. Right? And so, I mean, it was so hard. You just had to keep working through it and figure it out. And then I have 2 older brothers, and so you'd get a turn like every 30 minutes. So you'd sit there, I mean, and this is a one-player game. You'd sit there kind of watching and thinking, okay, here's what I'm going to do when I get there. And then you learn to be the armchair video game player, right? Kind of like the armchair quarterback where you're telling them what to do. It's like, hey, jump over that or grab that or whatever. And I mean, you think you know how you're going to do it when you get your turn, and then you realize it's a lot harder than it looks. And you're working through there trying to figure out how to win the game. Some of you are old enough to remember the Nintendo magazine. Anybody remember the Nintendo magazine with the cheat codes in it? Anybody want to confess to using a cheat code to win a game? Your victories mean nothing. I just want you to know that. Your victory means nothing. The rest of us, there were no cheat codes to Alex Kidd in Miracle World, and it was far easier to use a cheat than to actually, win the game. It was hard. It took a lot of time, a lot of effort. Eventually, we figured it out. And the thing that we discovered is that when somebody else had won the game, it was all of a sudden easier for you to win the game because they had advice for you, right? And they could tell you what you needed to do, how to defeat this boss and whatnot. In fact, we could say this, that the advice of someone who has already won is invaluable in helping you win. You see how they played, you see how they beat the boss, you see how they were successful, and you could make it to the end. And we're going to talk more about this today in part 4 of our series, Pitfalls. Now, in case you haven't been with us, we've been in this series, Pitfalls, and we've been talking about how there are all kinds of pitfalls in life. Pitfalls are the unexpected things that can trip us up, things that maybe look safe, but they're not actually, and we can fall into them and discover that we have some problems along the way because of them. Now, as I was planning this series, I was thinking about all kinds of pitfalls. There are character pitfalls, or relational pitfalls, or just kind of life pitfalls, but I stumbled upon what I think are 6 faith pitfalls that Jesus warned us against. 6 things that Jesus essentially said, look, you need to be careful because in your faith journey, you're going to be tempted to fall into these things, and it's going to look normal. In fact, for some of us, we've fallen into some of these pitfalls before, or maybe you've known somebody who's fallen into some of the pitfalls we've been talking about and that we're going to continue talking about. And so because of that, we have to pay attention. We have to be careful. And the good news is that if you have fallen into them, there's a way forward. We can pick up where we fell off and jump back into the game and continue on and move toward the end, which is really what we're all about. But these 6 pitfalls are really important as it comes to our faith growth and our faith development. And if we can learn to pay attention to them and watch out for them, then we'll be better off. Now, I've been teaching you a Greek word, and this is kind of the indicator word that I've been looking at for the warnings that Jesus gave. It's the word proseuo. And I'm not going to make you say it today, but just know in 2 weeks there's going to be a quiz. And it's not going to be a pop quiz, okay? Because I'm telling you ahead of time. So just be ready. I'm going to ask you to say it. I'm not even going to pronounce it for you. You just got to say it on your own without it up there on the screen. Proseuo, all right? It's a Greek word that means pay attention or keep on the lookout for, or to be on one's guard against. And so Jesus, there are 6 different contexts where he used this word to warn his followers about these faith pitfalls that we need to pay close attention to, because when we pay attention and when we avoid them, they can actually help us grow our faith. So in case you haven't been with us, I'm going to run through really fast. We're not going to do this in the subsequent weeks, but just for today, I just want to run through real fast so you know what we're talking about. The first pitfall was to avoid ignoring God in your heart. Avoid the pitfall of ignoring God in your heart, which is kind of using religion to get the attention of other people. That's what Jesus was talking about. When you use religion and religiosity to make other people look at you and say, oh, he's such a good Christian. She's such a good Christian, which, by the way, there's no such thing as a good Christian by biblical definitions, right? So, you just can't be good enough. And so, but I'm trying to perform. I'm trying to look good so people look at me and pat me on the shoulder. Oh, you're so holy. He's so holy. She's so holy. And Jesus says that's a pitfall. Because religion is a means to a relationship with God, and that relationship begins in your heart. So you've got to not worry about what other people are doing and what other people are seeing. That's not what all this is about. It's about connecting with me, connecting with God, God would say. And then the second one was avoid the pitfall of believing you can be good enough. It's using religion to get God's attention. And what Jesus would say is you can't be good enough. Because if you could be good enough, Jesus wouldn't have had to come to earth. He wouldn't have had to give his life for the sacrifice of the sins of the world, which is what we celebrate coming up here in just a couple of weeks at Easter. If you could be good enough, Jesus wouldn't have had to die. And so Jesus said, no, you can't be good enough. That's why I came. And that's why it's so important to hold two things in tension that were actually the next pitfall. So I'm getting ahead of myself. Here's the next pitfall. Avoid the pitfall of living out your faith in isolation from other people. The idea that I'm going to do faith on my own, that it's private, my faith is my deal, it's Nunya, remember that? Nunya business. I do my own deal, you do your own deal, but we don't want to interact. And what we learned last week is that, we're actually part of a body. And the reason why what we do matters is because your sin impacts my life. If I'm part of the same body with you, if you're hurting, it's hurting me. And if I'm hurting, it's hurting you. And so we have to hold two very important things in tension: vigilance against sin and radical forgiveness. That we're in this together. We need to move forward together. We need to be for each other. And the common thread in all of this is what I would call spiritual humility. Spiritual humility, which says, I know I'm not God. I'm going to place my confidence instead in God. And rather than trying to rely on myself and depend on myself, I'm not trying to be God. I'm not trying to control God. I'm trying to put my hands into God's hands. Put my life into God's hands. And so today, the pitfall we're going to talk about is along these lines, but it's where we go for guidance in life, because we all need guidance at some point in life, right? I mean, whether you're a young kid or whether you're president of the United States, even President Biden has advisors around them. As long as we have a little bit of humility, which hopefully we all have, we all recognize we need some guidance somewhere along the way. One of the things that I've discovered as I've gotten older, because when you're a kid, you look at the old people or the older people, you look at your parents and you look at everyone who's kind of up there, and you look at them as like they've got life figured out. You know what I mean? Like my parents knew everything. They knew how to fix every problem, how to fix every skin knee. They knew how to, solve issues around the house or when the car broke down or whatever. Then you get into high school and you think your parents are dumber than dirt and they don't really know what they're talking about. And then you get into college maybe or move out of the house and you realize, oh, they weren't as dumb as I thought they were. Actually, I was the dumb one who thought I knew everything, right? You know what I'm talking about. But as you get older, the thing you realize is that everything in life is kind of an experiment. You know what I mean? Kind of like trying to get through that video game and get to the end and figure out how it's going to work. And we're all just trying to figure this out. I think about the pandemic over the last couple of years. And the challenges that we've faced with that. And nobody's been through a pandemic before. Some of us did okay through it. Some of us struggled through it. Some of us rocked at it, right? I mean, we're kind of all along the way. We're all trying to figure it out. And the people that we look to figure it out are the people who guide us. We all look somewhere at some point in time. And if I know anything in this life, it's because I experimented with it. I tried to figure it out. If I know how to fix something around the house, it's because it broke and there's YouTube. And I don't know how people did it in generations before YouTube, because I guess you had those big Reader's Digest books or something, or the Sears Fix-It book, whatever it was, but if I know how to parent my kids, it's because I've had kids, or I've worked through the toddler age at least of kids. In fact, I wouldn't go to me for advice on how to raise kids older than toddlers, because it's all an experiment. Because, back before I had kids, I had all kinds of theories about parenting and no children. And now I have 3 kids and no theories, because I realized I don't know it all, right? I mean, there's just this sense where as you get older, you begin to realize how much you don't know and how much we all need guidance. Here's my point. Until a path is tried and true, it's just an experiment for me and you. Right? I mean, until we've figured it out, it's just an experiment, and we're just all trying to work through it, and we're all trying to figure it out. But we all look somewhere for guidance. So where do we look? right? I mean, that's kind of our level playing field. Our level playing field is this, that we all need guidance at some point. We all need guidance as it comes to parenting. We all need guidance at some point as it comes to our finance, as it comes to our relationships, our dating, our marriage, as it comes to our schooling, as it comes to all kinds of things, our faith. So where do we look? Where do you look? Who are the people you're looking to? Whether it's your parents or friends or gurus. Gurus have this new job in our culture, right? They produce books and everybody looks at their YouTube videos and we think they're so smart. I mean, but we look to all kinds of people, social media, YouTube, counselors, teachers, self-help books, self-help sections, Hollywood stars, right? Our heroes. We're so desperate for guidance sometimes that, I don't know if you've noticed this, we're not always very discerning about where we get our guidance. We're just trying to win the game, but we're not always paying attention at the voices that we listen to in order to win the game. And what Jesus talked about is that that's actually a pitfall that we have to be really careful about. So we're going to take a look at his words here. We're going to be in what's called the Sermon on the Mount. Now, the Sermon on the Mount, in case you're not from a church background, it's this very long sermon that Jesus delivered. We think that it's probably one big sermon, but it could be lots of sermons that Matthew decided to tie together when he wrote his gospel or the biography he wrote of Jesus' life. And so in the Sermon on the Mount, it's several chapters, 3 chapters of Jesus just kind of teaching. Now, Jesus was an incredible teacher. In fact, there was probably a lot of mooing going on in the middle of the sermon. You know what the mooing is? Christians have made this very popular. It's when you hear something that somebody says that you like, you go, right? Right? You know what I mean? Yeah, the Christian mooing. It's kind of a funny thing. And so, I mean, there was probably lots of mooing because Jesus was such a good teacher and he was so inspirational. And people had long attention spans back then, unlike us today. We have short attention spans. But I mean, so they just sit there all afternoon listening to Jesus speaking. And so we're not going to go through the whole Sermon on the Mount, which you should do. I would highly encourage you. It begins in Matthew chapter 5. We're going to pick up at the beginning of the end of the Sermon on the Mount. And so here's what Jesus was doing. He's basically setting up this whole picture of how to live life. And he's saying, here's how to live life to the fullest. And then he begins to draw his conclusions. And here's what he says in Matthew chapter 7, beginning at 13, verse 13. He says, enter through the narrow gate. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. It's the most common path, and lots of people go through it. Now, just because everybody's going through the wide gate doesn't actually mean that it's a good thing. In fact, he goes on, he says, but small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. So Jesus is like, look, there are lots of teachers telling you all sorts of things, and they're all directing you down this wide gate, this wide path that's leading to the same place, and everybody's going down that path. But what Jesus is saying is, look, I've been teaching something different, which is frankly why the crowds were so enraptured by what he had to say, because it was so different. He's like, look, this is a narrow gate. This is not the easy path. If it were easy, everyone would be going this way. But it's a good path. It's a path that leads to life, he says. It leads to life. And so if you'll take these words of mine, if you'll put them into practice, it's like going through that narrow gate. It's going through the narrow path. And it's not as roomy, right? You're not going to see as many of your friends on it, but I promise you it is going to lead you somewhere good. My path is different. And again, it was. And he just spent all this time, talking about anxiety and worry and money. He talked about sexuality. He talked about marriage and divorce. He talks about adultery. He talks about judging other people and our relationship with God. I mean, he just talked about so many things. He went on to the Beatitudes, which sometimes we call the beautiful attitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the meek. They'll inherit the kingdom of God. I mean, he just presented this incredible picture. And then he says, not many are going to follow it, but if you choose to follow it, it's going to lead to life. And then he gave the pitfall. This is the prosecho, right? This is the important thing to pay attention to. Here's what he says next. He says, watch out. That's it, prosecho. Watch out. Be on your lookout for, be aware, be on your guard for false prophets Like as you're trying to figure out how to live your life, there are going to be people leading you in the wrong direction. There are going to be people telling you the wrong way to go. They're going to be leading you down that wide path that everyone else is going to go down. They're leading you astray. And so as you're looking for direction, they're happy to give it, but it is not good direction. He goes on, he says this. He says, they come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. Like they look innocent. They look friendly because, sheep look friendly, don't they? Nice and woolly and petty. But they're ferocious wolves. They're hiding something. They want to devour you. They want to eat you alive. Now, when I hear, the term false prophet, and if you don't come from a church context, that's a little bit of kind of a weird thing to say. For those of us who grew up in church, we hear the word false prophet and all kinds of things come to our minds. Sometimes I think about the people who make predictions. Like every year there's some astrological sign and somebody's making some prediction about. A couple of years ago there was a blood moon and the world was going to end and it didn't. And then there's the Y2K crowd, right? That the world was going to end at Y2K. And then sometimes, there are cult leaders like David Koresh. David Koresh, remember him? Or Jim Jones, he led a cult. Or they're the Bible teachers. Sometimes there are Bible teachers who are teaching things that aren't really from God, or it's kind of a little bit of a mixed bag of stuff. And so when we hear false prophets, that's kind of what we tend to think about. Those are the people that Jesus, maybe was pointing at. But I think what Jesus was getting at is that, look, he was one voice among many voices in his time period. He was one voice among many voices, and he was giving people a very direct way to live. And so he's calling our attention to and saying, look, how do you know if my voice is true? How do you know if the voices you're listening to for direction in general are true? How do you know to believe what Jesus had to say? How do you know to believe what I have to say? How can we judge the voices we're listening to know that they're the voices we should be listening to, that they should be directing us? Because the truth is, false prophets are all around us telling us how to succeed at life, telling us how we should live our lives. Go to any self-help section. There is no, loss of books there. There's so many. And the problem is, what Jesus is saying is there are a lot of people who don't really know what they claim to know. Either their lives don't reflect what they're proclaiming to teach, or what they're teaching doesn't result in what they say it's going to result in. They're wolves in sheep's clothing. So how do we know? There are all kinds of things false prophets promise us, and I have a list. It's not meant to be an exhaustive list, but there's some things to really think about. The first one is success, right? False prophets promise us success. They say, if we do this, if we buy that, if we marry him or her or date them or drive that car, or, if we climb up the corporate ladder, regardless of who we have to step on in the process, if we sign our kids up for travel this or that, right? They're going to have success. It doesn't really matter, if I have to cross my ethics. It doesn't really matter if I have to set my values aside. If I just move in the right direction that they're telling me to move in, whatever success is defined by them, then I'll have it. And people will look at me and people will celebrate me and say, oh, he's so successful. She's so successful. And the truth is, there are times when people tell us that. And maybe some of what they say is true, but in order to get that success, we have to say goodbye to the things that are important to us, like our values. Or we have to say no to our families because it requires working 300 million hours a week, right? And so at the end of the day, it's not really the success that we were promised. It may be partially true, but there's some hidden sacrifices that they don't tell us about. Or here's another one. Here's another false prophet. It's happiness. Happiness. We all want to be happy, right? Who doesn't want to be happy? And marketers tell us how to be happy. We just need our happy what. And our happy what happens to be whatever they're selling. Whether it's their thing, their product, their lifestyle, the vacation, the timeshare, the beer. Why is it people in beer commercials are always so happy, right? If I just had a bottle or a can of that in my hand, I would finally be happy. Or sometimes it's a person in bed, or it's a body, right? If I just had the body that looked right, then I'd finally be happy. Or in the Christian world, frankly, sometimes there's Christian crap that we're always selling, and people are selling, and books. And if you read my book and buy my stuff, you'll be happy. I've got the key. I've got the answer. Just do this and you'll be happy. But the funny thing about happy what is that it leads us to say, well, happy what else, right? It leads us to look for the happy what else, because the happy what keeps us happy for a couple days, but then you realize you bought that thing that you thought was going to make you happy, and it didn't actually make you happy in the end. So you just need to look for happy what else. And we realize that happiness becomes this external thing to us, that if only we could attain this external thing, then finally we'd have it. Oh, here's another one. Here's another false prophet. It's identity. Because we all want to have an identity. We all want to be known by someone for something, which is why the show Cheers was so popular in the 1980s. Anybody remember Cheers? Sometimes you got to go where everybody knows your name, and they're always glad you came. 2 people remember that show. I can't believe it. And I was like a child back then. But but we connect with that. People connect with that because we want to be known by someone for something. We want to fit in. We want to have an identity. And so people say, well, come follow me. You'll fit in. We'll give you an identity. Or social media is so good at algorithms that, present us with people and posts that support everything that we already believe, and we get entrenched in our identity, and this is who I am, and this is my truth, and forget anything else, that's all fake news, whatever. It's false information. And so we lean into this concept of identity, but it's something external to us. Here's another one, pleasure. Pleasure. In a culture like ours that has so much stuff and so much money and so much free time, we don't know what to do with ourselves. So we search for pleasure. It's a good way of anesthetizing ourselves and numbing the other voices that we hear. And so you can just get rid of your pain if you smoke this or drink that or date him or her or sleep with them or, buy this or, OD on that, right? You can get rid of your pain if you just pursue pleasure. Give your kids a device to occupy them, then they're not nagging you all the time. That's pleasure, right? And we discover that it's temporary. And not only is it temporary, it kind of has some consequences at times. Here's a funny false prophet. It's freedom, because we all want to be free. We don't want anyone telling us what to do. Whether it's a parent, you teenagers, you don't want your parents telling you what to do. Whether it's a boss, we don't want our boss telling us what to do. Your school, you don't want your marriage, right? You don't want your spouse telling you what to do. And ironically, when we follow the siren call of freedom, we end up being enslaved by the things that we think are going to set us free. They're false prophets, right? You can find freedom here. There is no real freedom. Freedom is found within boundaries, just so you know. But it's this external thing. If I just go after it, then finally I'll fully be free. Now here's the last one. And again, this isn't meant to be all exhaustive, but it's the idea of self-worth. Like we all want to have value. And so if I do this, if I date him or her, if I drive that, if I live in this house or live in this neighborhood, then my worth, my value goes up. But again, it's external. And because it's external, it doesn't ultimately last. All of these lead to external sort of things. And the false prophets tell us, well, if you can just figure this out, then, we've got the answer and we'll help direct your lives. But really they're lies because they're inconsistent with the person who promises them and they don't actually deliver. And here's the other interesting thing, and maybe you noticed this. They're kind of all about you. In fact, we could put the word my in front of this. Let's just go ahead. Or promise my success, my happiness, my identity, my pleasure, my freedom, and my self-worth, which is all about me. And come on, we're smart enough to know that if you live your life for yourself, you'll have nothing to show for yourself except yourself. At the end of the day, those are the saddest people. Those are the saddest funerals to go to. It's all about me, and it's a lonely way to live. And that's what the prophets promise us. So who do we know? How do we know who to listen to? How do we know what to listen to? Well, Jesus, he gave us an answer. Here's what he said. He says, by their fruit you will recognize them. By their fruit. Now, the idea here, what Jesus is saying is that your life is producing something. Every life is producing something. And so if you want to know whether or not the person you're trying to follow or the person you're leaning into, the prophet that you're listening to, so to speak, if you want to know if they're worth listening to, look at the fruit of their lives. What does it tell you? Look at their consistency. And when we do that, look at Hollywood. They all want to tell us how to live, and yet they're on marriage number 12. Their kids are train wrecks. They're in debt up to their noses, even though they have more money than you or I could imagine. You think about the politicians who tell us what to do and how to live, but they're not doing it. It's like, it's for you, not for me. Or sometimes there are parents with kids, right? And we think about, they're telling you how to raise your kids, but you look at their kids and you think, I don't know if that's really for me. Or the evangelists, this is my favorite, who tell you that you should invest a bunch of money into their ministry and buy their stuff because God's going to bless you 3,000-fold. But they don't even believe it because they don't invest their own money in there. Instead, they're driving, fancy cars, living in $1 million homes, wearing celebrity shoes. And, it's just inconsistent. Jesus says it's inconsistent. So instead, you need to look at the fruit of their lives. Does it display the fruit of the Spirit? We've talked about this in the New Testament. The Apostle Paul, he talked about when God begins living in your life, there are things that begin to change. You begin to see love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and gentleness, faithfulness and self-control. In fact, Paul goes on to say, against such things there is no law. In other words, we all want them, right? We're not going to make a law against them because those are things we know we need. I want to be more loving. I want to be more joyful, right? I want to have more self-control. We all want those things. So Jesus says, look, you've got to look at the fruit of their lives. By their fruit, you'll recognize them. Then he continues on. He says this. He says, do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? That's a rhetorical question. The answer is no. Right? Likewise, he says, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. The fruit follows the tree. You cannot put things into practice that somebody else is putting into practice and get something different out of it. Like the wide path is always going to lead you to the wide end. The narrow path will always lead you to the narrow end. It always delivers the exact same thing. You cannot pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles. It does not work that way. But following someone else is about cultivating something. Jesus says, look, your life, their lives are cultivating something. What are they cultivating? He goes on, he says this. He says, every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Like there's no value to it other than to be used as firewood. It is destined for destruction. That's where it's headed. Their lives aren't worth listening to. And then he says this, thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them. So pay attention to their fruit. The fruit is the key. And what Jesus is saying is, look, I am giving you a better way. I've set out, life, death, blessing, cursing. Follow me. I've set a narrow path. Everyone else is the wide path. Which one are you going to lean your life into? Now, here's the thing, because as I think about, where our culture is headed, I think about what our culture has been known for, because in the past, Christianity, faith, values, they were at the center of who we were as Americans. And as we move away from that, can you honestly look at our world around us and say that things are better? I mean, can you honestly look around us and say, yeah, I want that from my life? I mean, they're so full of joy. I want joy. I don't see joy when I look around. All right? I want peace. I don't see a lot of peace when I look around. I want kindness. I don't see any kindness at all. So Jesus is saying, you got to look at the fruit. You got to see where their lives are headed because your life will be headed in the same direction. So you need to avoid this pitfall. Avoid the pitfall of misguided mentors, people that you're looking to for direction in your life, but who don't have the right fruit in their life to give you direction, whose lives are inconsistent with the advice that they're giving and therefore will not lead you where it is ultimately you want to go. So I want to ask you two questions, then we're going to wrap up here and finish. The first one is this: whom do you look to for direction? When you think about your life, and be honest with yourself, whom do you look to for direction? When you're trying to figure out how to parent, when you're trying to figure out how to be successful and what it means to have purpose and self-worth and identity, where do you go? Who do you look to? Now, here's the thing. If you're a follower of Jesus, or if you're here for the first time, rather, and you don't even know what you believe yet, and you're just trying to figure it all out, and somebody invited you to church today, we're so glad you're here. And I have no right to tell you where you should be looking or what kind of person you should be looking to for direction. But for those of us who are followers of Jesus, I think we've got an invitation to say, who is it that we're looking to for direction? Are their lives producing the kind of fruit that we want for our lives? And listen, This applies to me too. Because I realize I get to stand up here once a week and put a microphone on and people are listening to me for direction. And quite honestly, you should be asking yourself, what kind of fruit is he producing in his life? And is it consistent with the type of fruit that I want to be produced in my life? And you should do the same for John and the same for Dan when they're up here and anyone else who's up here. Because truthfully, we're not trying to pull something over on you. I promise you. In fact, there's a scripture about the accountability of pastors and people who are teachers that we have. And I pray so much that I teach what is true and accurate and I lead people in the right way. That is a burden that I carry. But it doesn't mean I'll do it perfectly. And so that means as you look at my life, I hope you'll kick the tires, so to speak, right? And see if I'm living out what I'm proclaiming. If you see love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, that fruit of the Spirit, if you begin seeing that living out in me, or if you come talk to me about it and my response is, forget you, I don't, or if I respond and say, you know what, you're right, I was wrong. I'm praying for God's strength for that. That's different. But if I'm not willing to be open, if there's no fruit, then you should replace me with somebody from whom you'll see some fruit. You always need to be paying attention to the people you're listening to in your life. See if there's fruit and see if it's fruit that you actually want in your life. That's what Jesus was saying. Are they really worth following? And here's another question. Where are the people you're looking to for direction getting their direction? Because there are all kinds of voices in the world today. There are all kinds of voices in the world today, and this seems so obvious, and yet it's so not. It's like, don't take money advice from people who are broke, right? That seems obvious, doesn't it? But it's not. Or don't take relational advice from people who are on marriage number 8, and that one's falling apart. Don't take parenting advice from people whose children act like the spawn of Satan, and you don't want them in your home. It seems so obvious, and yet we just ignore it. We follow these misguided mentors. And so as you think about the people you're listening to and who are speaking into your life and who you're allowing to be your prophets, so to speak, where are they leading you? Where are they getting their direction from? And if you're not a follower of Jesus, follow whoever you want. But for us Christians, I think we've got an invitation to ask ourselves the question, I don't want somebody leading my life who isn't following Jesus. And that can be a hard thing, especially if the people we want to look up to, say a parent or a sibling or a close friend, not following Jesus and they want to give us advice. Sometimes it's hard in those situations to say, you know what, you're not listening to the voice that I want you to be listening to, and so I'm not going to follow what it is that you have to say. Where are the people you're looking to for direction getting their direction? The thing about Jesus, he was so consistent. Like as you look at his life and you think about that fruit of the Spirit, Jesus was so loving. He was so joyful. People accused him of being a partier because he was so joyful. He was so patient. He was so forgiving. Think about when he was crucified on the cross, right? And he's up there on the cross and people are making fun of him and mocking and jeering. They're casting lots for his clothes. And what does Jesus say? Do you remember? He says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. If they could see from your point of view, God, I don't think they'd be doing what they're doing. But they can't, so forgive them. How much more consistent do you get? There was something just so different about him. So avoid the pitfall of misguided mentors in your life. So at the end of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, he actually shares a parable. It's probably a parable you're familiar with because he talks about a wise man, not a wise guy, but a wise man who decides to build a house. And he goes to this painstaking effort of building his house with a rock-solid foundation. You probably know the story. And then the storms come and, the rains fall down and the storms come up. And the house on the rock stands firm. Because the inevitable storms of life did come, but this person had built his foundation on rock-solid ground. And then there's a real wise guy, a real fool, Jesus would say, who built his house on a sandy foundation because he didn't want to go through the work and the painstaking effort of building it on rock. And it looked pretty and it didn't take as much effort. And it was a lot easier. It was the wide path that everyone else was going down. And then the inevitable storms of life came and the house went, remember how it goes? splat. And Jesus says, look, I've set before you two ways. I've set before you a narrow path and a wide path. If you do the hard thing, if you follow the narrow path, if you do what I'm teaching you, you can build your house on rock. And then the storms of life will come and you will be able to stand. But if you take the wide road, the wide path, the one that everyone else is going down, I'm just telling you the storms of life are going to come. And eventually, that house will fall. So whose voice are you going to listen to? Jesus asked. Who's going to influence your life? And again, as I look at our world, as we move further away from Jesus, I can't say we're better. In fact, I think it's kind of interesting. The nations have risen and fallen, kingdoms have come and gone, and yet the kingdom of Jesus somehow shines through over and over and over again. There's something legitimate there. There's something real there. There's something of power there. Jesus said he came to give life and give it to the full. And I tell you what, the people that I see in my life who are living out the truth of Jesus have that. So who are you listening to? Whom do you look to for direction? Where are the people you're looking to for direction? Getting their direction. We would be wise to pay attention, to beware the pitfall of following misguided mentors. So we're going to pick it back up here next week in part 5 of Pitfalls. But let me pray for us. Father, this is so hard because all around us we have voices telling us what to do, telling us what to believe, what to think, who to follow, leading us in the direction of success and happiness and pleasure and self-worth. And then there's you who says, I want to do something inside of you. And if you begin putting these practices into place, then it's like building your house on a rock. God, I want that for myself. I want it for my church family here. I want it for our community, for our country, for our world. As we listen to voices, as we listen to those telling us where to go and what to do, would you help us to be discerning? Would you help us to pay attention, to lean in, to see the fruit of those voices, to see where they're going to lead us? And would you help us to be discerning? Help us not to follow the misguided mentors. Father, for the person in the room who's just been listening to the wrong voices, would today be an invitation and maybe a kick in the seat to say, I need to listen differently. I need to listen to a different voice that's calling me in a different way, that's calling me in the direction of my Heavenly Father. Father, thank you for the voice of Jesus, for his promise that we would have life and have it to the full. Would we lean into that voice? Give us courage to do that. I pray in Jesus' name, amen.